Why don't we start with just a little bit of your background and where and how you grew up?
All right, so I grew up in East Point in Marietta, went to Wheeler High School. You're up there. Went to Auburn University. All right, a little bit better.
War Eagle.
Went to go War Eagle, not War Eagles. Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. And then I went to law school at the University of Georgia. And my major at Auburn was international business. And so I went to Georgia because they had a strong international law program. And I took one course in international law and decided that's not what I wanted to do. And so I began to look at other options, and my interest after that was criminal prosecution. I wanted to be a prosecutor. And I took all the courses in criminal law I could. I got an internship in the Attorney General's office. They gave me a job offer and they put me in property tax. So it's one of those journeys where you just kind of go where you're told.
Right. Let's step back for just a minute to your time at Auburn, because you made history at Auburn. You were the president of student government, and you were the first African American ever elected to that position at Auburn University. Could you talk a little bit about that and what effect, if any, that's had on your career since then?
So I got involved with student government largely because when I first got to Auburn, I didn't enjoy it, didn't like it. And it took me a while to realize that I'm somebody that needs to feel connected with what's going on around me in order to feel at peace and at home. I felt too detached, so I got involved in student government. And every job I've ever had in my professional life has been as government. I love state government work because I like knowing what's going around, who's doing it, and being able to put my hands on it. So I got involved with student government and just enjoyed it, enjoyed the campus, enjoyed campus life. And then as I was approaching my senior year, I had to figure out what to do next. And I was either going to move up or out. And the only place up was the president position. It had never been done before, so I just started talking to friends, what do you think, what do you think? And they said, hey, it's a great idea, let's go for it. And we did. We had 3 candidates in the race. This is old history. It's probably 50 years ago, just about. But we had 3 candidates in the race. We got 60% of the vote. We had 18,600 students. 3.6% was African American at the time, and it just happened. Now, what my father asked me every now and then, he'll say, was that experience worth it? Did you get a lot of it? I said, oh yeah, it was the best education I've gotten. I use what I learned in that role every day. I use it especially now, serving as chief. It's the same thing. It's the same blocking and tackling. It's just in a different venue. But being engaged in campus activities, working together with other people to solve problems. Maybe the problems are different, maybe the people are different, but the process is very much the same.
One of the things I often ask our guests is whether law school really prepared you for what you did, and sometimes I even ask whether people liked law school. You don't have to answer that second one, but I think
I'm glad to answer that one. I did not like law school. I didn't expect to like law school. When friends and family asked me if I enjoyed law school, I said no, but you're not supposed to. It's like boot camp. You don't ask people, did you enjoy boot camp? You just get through it and get to where you want to be, and hopefully you'll land in a place that you look back on and you think, okay, this was worth it. It was worth it. So there were people that enjoyed law school. I wondered about those folks. They're probably some of but did I get out of it what I wanted? Absolutely. I did get out of it. Made some good friends. I learned how to read the law and study the law and practice law. Some of that took place in the classroom. Some of it took place outside the classroom. But the bottom line is the law school process accomplished what it needed to accomplish. Now, the other part of that is I was not at the top of the class. I was not near the top of the class. What I usually say is I was at the top of the bottom half. And I knew some people at the top. But, it's like being 50th place in the Miss America pageant. You're still a very attractive candidate. So, You don't have to be top of the class to be a very good, productive lawyer.
One of the things I know you did, we were chatting earlier, was that you participated in moot court. Again, can you talk about the importance of that and what that taught you?
Well, again, I guess in law school I had to find my niche as well, and I'm not law review material. I don't even like reading law reviews. But moot court was really a nice fit for me. Judge Verda Colvin, who is a Superior Court judge, was Verda Andrews at the time. She was my moot court coach. She wore us out. She ran us through the ringer. And the one thing that she emphasized that I didn't think about going into moot court was the importance of writing. And she painstakingly made us work through our brief and make sure every single sentence was concise and tight. And I learned a lot through that. And then the oral advocacy aspect of it was great. So I got the most out of moot court than any other activity I participated in law school. And like I said, I really didn't expect to learn to write as much as I did in that process, but that was a real strong emphasis.
Let's talk a minute about the transition into being a lawyer from being a law student. What surprised you the most when you first began practicing?
Well, one of the hardest things that I had to adjust to starting work was not having a nap after lunch. I used to come home after work and I was just exhausted. It took me a while to get those muscles up and running so I could go 9 to 5, 9 to 6 and go strong the whole day. The other aspect of working in the Attorney General's office, it's about 100, 110 lawyers covering the entire scope of state government, which is really not a lot. And so when you're assigned something as a lawyer, it's yours. And when you're given a subject area, it's yours. There's nobody else you're sharing it with. So when citizens called, they would call and they would look at me for an answer, and I didn't know any more than they did, many times. But it was a really great opportunity to learn, because if you like the sink or swim environment, which I did, they gave me all the responsibility I could have handled. And I was able to go against some really strong lawyers, some seasoned lawyers, and I learned a lot from them as well.
You started with property tax?
Property tax.
How was that?
It was just like you thought it would be. I really didn't want to do a property tax, and I talked to friends when they assigned me to that area. This is how it worked. When you do the internship and you accept a job offer, they ask you where you want to go. And they also ask you where you don't want to go. They reserve the right to place you where they need to place you. There are 2 sections I didn't want to work in. I didn't want to do property work, and I didn't want to do tax work. So Sunday night, before I started work on Monday, I got the call, and the voice on the other end of the phone said, "My name's Dan Formby. I'm going to be your boss. We're going to have you doing property tax." I said, "Oh my gosh, you're kidding me." So I called friends and told them what was going on. I was kind of depressed, and they said, "Well, you're going to love working for Dan Formby." I said, "Yeah, but it's property tax, right?" "Yeah, but you're going to love working for Dan Formby." So I go in on Monday, didn't know who he was, and met Dan Formby. Well, Dan Formby was probably one of the least impressive people that you would imagine when you first met him, because he looked the part and all, but he really just didn't have a lot to say. Wasn't a big conversationalist. And but over time, I got to really appreciate the wisdom that man had, the love for his employees that he had. I ended up loving working for Dan Formby. He's a older white gentleman from the suburbs of Rome, Georgia, and every professional decision I ever made, I always talked with him, usually first. The one exception was when I got married and I talked to my wife. She said, "Well, what are you talking to me for? You need to talk to Dan Formby." So he put me in that space, and one of the things they told me was, and this helped a lot, if you have a question involving property tax, before you start hitting any of these books, we used to do research in books, before you start hitting any of these books, walk down the halls, because anything that's in the books involving tax in the state of Georgia involve litigators who are on this hall. So have a conversation with these people, and that will help direct and direct your research, concentrate your efforts, and that was a big help. I didn't want to learn the subject matter. I really didn't even understand the big picture of how property tax worked. But ultimately, over time, I did learn it, and I learned that, you know, if you want to make a lot of money in this world, say bye to your friends and family for about 6 months to a year, learn something that nobody else wants to learn, and come out and declare yourself an expert, and you can make a lot of money. I wasn't willing to do that, but I saw people who did. We hired those people as experts. But once I learned the subject matter, it was like anything else. I could move in and out of it, and I became very comfortable with it. And when I had opportunities to transfer to other sections, I ended up just staying because I enjoyed the work and enjoyed the people.
Well, during your time in the Attorney General's office, what did you like the best about that work, and what did you like the least?
So there's many things I liked the best. I liked that I was able to sit in the bleachers and watch state government work. So I wasn't on the field, I wasn't in the legislature, I wasn't in the governor's office, but I was advising these people, advising the agency heads, and so I got to see what was going on. So I like that a lot. Great people. Some of my best friends, and we'd go to lunch and we'd talk about everything that was important and mostly things that were unimportant. Just have a great time. I love the responsibility that they gave me right away. I was traveling the state, doing administrative hearings on county tax digests, and it was just me and the revenue department employee that was the client in essence. So that was fun. I loved that the work hours were reasonable. I loved that I was able to work and do good work and then leave and do some other things that I felt like that were important for me, and to get involved in the community, get involved with the church. So it was just a perfect fit.
Talk a little bit about the community involvement, the other things that you've spent your time doing outside of work. So I know that's important to you.
So the main thing I was involved in was Young Life Ministries. Anybody familiar with Young Life? Okay. So I was a volunteer leader for Young Life Ministries. We worked in Grady High School and Southside High School. Southside's now Maynard Jackson. But that largely served Grady homes and Techwood homes. So I was walking the streets of Techwood homes, coached the basketball team, and really just hung out with kids. Hung out with teenagers, which is still what I like to do. I love hanging out with teenagers, even though I have 3 in my home right now. When I was at Auburn, at one point, I wanted to change majors. I thought about changing majors, and I did a personality test. They said, do that, and let's have a conversation. And when I took the test, they said, you're either going to be in the law, a counselor, or a lawyer. And at the time, I had no interest in either one of those 3. And about 6 or 7 years later, I look up, and I'm pretty much doing all 3. I was practicing law, working in the Attorney General's office, counseling kids, and kind of acting like a youth pastor of sorts.
After a number of years in the Attorney General's office, you went to work for the governor.
Yes.
How did that transition come about? And then I want to ask you about what you did for the governor.
Well, when I went to work in the AG's office, Mike Bowers, who was the Attorney General at the time, hired me. He said, come work for us. Give us 4 years. After you give me 4 years, we'll teach you how to practice law. If you leave at that point, you leave with my blessing, but give us 4. So I planned on doing 4 and then seeing what else was out there. I got to 4, started looking around, didn't see anything I liked better. After about 10 or 11 years, I'm thinking I'm going to retire at the AG's office. My boss was about to retire, and I began having conversations with the front office, and they were saying I was going to be a candidate for that spot. They were looking to put me there. So I was thinking this is where I was going to be. So the governor got elected in November. There's a lot of media about who was going to be on his team and such. And I think it was a Thursday afternoon, I got a phone call from somebody from the Governor Purdue's transition team, and the voice on the other end said, my name is Bruce Bowers. Bruce Bowers is the son of Mike Bowers, who had hired me. And he said, I'm with the Governor Purdue's transition team. We want to know if you're interested in talking with us about joining the team. I said, well, that's interesting. What position did you have in mind? And he said, executive counsel. I said, well, you got to be kidding. Executive counsel, as you know, is the governor's primary lawyer. Paper had suggested that Bruce Bowers was going to do it. I said, I thought you were going to do it. I said, no, I wouldn't do it. So I said, well, let me get back with you. It really took me off guard because I did not expect that call. So I put down the phone and I went to go see Dan Foreman. Actually, I called my wife first. That's the time when she said, what are you doing talking to me? Go talk to Dan Foreman. So I talked to Dan Foreman, and in true Dan Foreman fashion, you ask him a question, and he just sits, and you just wait. And then he starts off, well, my mama used to say. And then, so that's what he did. He says, well, my mama used to say, it's hard to turn down a seat at the table. So then I talked to a whole bunch of other people. I talked to my mom, I talked to my dad, I talked to friends, you know, do you know this guy? What about him? You know, asked everybody all kinds of different angles, and it all came back down to, well, it's hard to turn down a seat at the table. And that's what ultimately drove my decision. So I called them back and said, okay, I'm interested in talking with you. That was a Thursday. Friday I called them back. Over the weekend I had to work on my resume because I wasn't looking for a job, didn't have a resume. Monday was my interview at 10. Monday at 5 was my callback interview with the governor and the chief of staff. Wednesday was a press conference announcing I was going to be the executive counsel.
That went fast.
It went very fast from Thursday to Wednesday.
Talk about what you did for the governor and maybe a little bit about what that did to prepare you for your judicial career, which of course came next.
So being the governor's counsel is almost everything you're not supposed to do as a lawyer in this sense. What you're trained to do here is to look at legal questions and analyze them and research and process to get to an answer. When you're the governor's lawyer, you don't have any time to do that. You're drinking from a fire hose, but you have to be resourceful. So at that point, I've been practicing for 11 years, 11 and a half or so, and you're traveling by instinct a lot of times. You have to know what areas you have to be careful about when you're confident moving forward. You have to be able to pick up the phone and call somebody in the Attorney General's office and say, hey, you deal with this. Is there anything you think I need to watch out for because we're about to jump? You have to be able to call people in the agencies and say, hey, what do you think about this? Are we right or is it? So you don't have time to do the research that you would normally do to be comfortable in the advice that you're giving. Plus, you're giving advice to the governor, who has the highest profile of any state official in the state, and the governor is relying on that advice. So there are times when the governor would come in my office and say, Harold, I want to make sure one last time we're right on this. You feel good about this? I'll say, yes, sir, we're good. And then he would go into his office, and in his office there's a suite of news reporters and TV cameras, and he's about to announce this initiative. And he's confident because his lawyer told him everything was just fine. And I'm sitting there thinking, boy, I hope I'm right. But it was the most fun I ever had in the workplace. It was fast-paced, when I talked about the joy I had watching the players on the field, well, now I'm on the field. I'm on the field, and I enjoyed every bit of it. I had to break myself away to go home. I'd look up and say, oh my gosh, it's 6:30. I need to get home. Times you go into the office, you have this to-do list, and you would just get pulled away from one thing to the next. Good people, tough problems you're dealing with. You know, the problems that hit the governor's office ultimately are the problems that are very, very hard to solve. Often those solutions can be found, but you're the one that the governor is the one who has worked for the job to be able to address those questions. So what I told people was, I didn't have the weight of the state on my shoulders, but I had the weight of the man who had the weight of the state on his shoulders.
Did you ever have to tell the governor no?
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, he, to his credit, one of the things that I think he wanted to have a sense of when he interviewed me was whether I would tell him no. And because he had the sense that I would, he said, okay, I need that. Now, he didn't necessarily like it, but he respected it, and to this day he respected it, and still, to this day he respects that. And there are times when you don't say no, but you problem solve. And so one of the things about being an in-house attorney is there's an art to it. And I had to learn the art of being in-house counsel, because in that environment, people want to go. They just want, they see an answer, they see an idea, they just want to go. They don't want somebody coming in and saying, hold it, slow down, maybe don't do it. And so what I learned to do is to just kind of slide into a meeting, and if I had questions and concerns, I wouldn't say anything then and there, because that's how you become uninvited to meetings. I would go back and do my research. If everything was fine and I didn't need to say anything, I just kept it to myself. If I found problems, then I would try to find alternative ways to accomplish that. So when I did have a conversation with somebody, I could say, here's a problem, but I think we can get there if we go about it this way. And oftentimes, if I did it that way, that was much more appreciated.
The time came when the governor appointed you to the court, I believe, to replace Justice Fletcher.
Correct.
Tell us how that came about, and then I want to ask you what it was like to make the transition to being on the Supreme Court of Georgia.
One of the jobs, there are many parts of the job of being counsel to the governor, but one of the first things that the executive council has to do is work with the governor to create the Judicial Nominating Commission. The Judicial Nominating Commission is the tool that the governor uses to screen judicial applicants and create a short list, and the governor appoints from that short list. Now, all that's by custom. There's nothing in the law that requires that, but it's custom. And so I helped the governor create the Judicial Nominating Commission, and the chair of that was Mike Bowers, who is the Attorney General, who had hired me. You see how things just kind of start cycling, and you'll see that in your career, in your personal journey. You'll see that there'll be some consistent trend lines. You don't know who those people will be, but you'll look back down the path, and you'll see some people that keep popping up. So when Justice Fletcher announced that he was going to retire, the governor came to me and he came to Mike Bowers and said, look, we know there are going to be candidates who are going to put in for this spot. We know who the usual suspects will be. I kind of want somebody different. And I want you, talking to me, and Mike to brainstorm and be thinking about other people that might not put in, that should put in, and we need to get behind and encourage him to give us a chance to consider. So Mike and I would talk, and we would talk with the governor and say, well, what about this person, or what about that person? Well, but yes, maybe, no, maybe. And then ultimately, Mike says to me, well, what about you? And I said, well, you got to be kidding. And we started having that conversation, and the governor was open to it, and so I put in. And I told the governor, I said, Governor, I don't meet the profile. I was still fairly young. I was 38 when I took the bench. The youngest ever was 36. That was Justice Sears. One of the rules that Mike Bowers had and all the other attorneys general had, when you work in the Attorney General's office, you stay out of politics. So I was not known amongst the political base. I was not known outside of the inner circle of government, because I swum in that pool, and only that pool. My time outside of the work was with teenagers, so as long as teenagers were voting, I was strong, but they weren't. So I told the governor, I'm not in your wheelhouse. He said, well, that's my problem. I'll handle that. But would you serve? And I said, well, sure. So I put in, and we went through the process, and he appointed me, and that was 13 years ago. Yeah, 13 years ago, 2005.
When you find yourself in your late 30s, a justice on the Supreme Court of Georgia, what was that transition like? What surprised you in that job? And then I want to know what you liked.
Well, the immediate thing was this. It was kind of funny. It was in June, I believe. Yeah, it was June when the governor announced that he was going to put me on the court. And at the time, the state bar was meeting in Savannah. And, the state bar, we have, 40,000 lawyers in the bar. The Board of Governors meets, that's about 300, 400 people. And so about 1,000 folks down there. And Chief of Staff came to my office and said, the governor's about to make the announcement. It's going to be you. You need to get in the plane right now and go down to the state bar meeting. So I get on the plane, I go down to the state bar meeting. And the announcement had been made. And people didn't know whether to congratulate me or throw me out the window, because they really didn't know who this guy was. And in fact, that was pretty much the theme of the response: who is this guy? And so I would walk through the hallways, and some of my friends and people I knew would come up, and they were happy. And there were a lot of folks who just didn't know what to do with me. The good thing was that the bar leadership in particular, gave me a fair shot, and that's all you can ask for. They gave me a fair shot. They didn't know if I was going to be a renegade, a cowboy, or if I even had the minimum level of intelligence necessary. But they gave me a fair shot, and then they watched, and they saw that I took the job seriously, and that I treated them respectfully and took an interest in them, and they in me, and we developed a relationship. And they were very eager to be very protective of me as they were of all the other justices on the court. So I'm very grateful for that. And now when I walk through the halls at the state bar meeting, it's a much different reception, and they're my friends, and I'm thankful. So the transition was interesting from that standpoint. There's a lot of awkwardness. We had to get to know each other. People say, were you so young? I said, well, I promised to get older, and I did. But ultimately, once I got to the office and closed the door and looked at the briefs and had the books out, it felt like any other job. The law was the same, the research was the same, the thought process was the same. It's just that when we had conversations, I was talking to other justices as opposed to the folks down the hall on property tax. And when we came to resolutions, I wasn't writing briefs, we were writing opinions. But the process felt very, very much the same. And that was very comforting. The other thing, as far as transition goes, if you're going to be a judge, the Supreme Court of the state of Georgia is where you want to go. If you want to be a Superior Court judge, I don't know how those folks do it, because they have just wide range subject matter, and they have the parties right in front of them, and they're making calls right then and there. And so the instincts, I was talking about instincts before, they're governed by instincts a lot of times. They're governed by knowledge, but it's so wide and so many opportunities to make mistakes. I have the luxury of reviewing their work, and we have all the time in the world by comparison. We don't have all the time, but we have a lot more time than the trial court judges do. As long as we sit in the right seat and walk out in the right order, then we're generally good. That's all the orientation you need to be a Supreme Court justice. But the trial court judges really have it tough, and I admire that they can do what they do.
Judge Tripp self-described being an appellate judge like being in a replay booth.
Yeah.
Is there a typical day, not as chief, we're going to get to chief just a second, I know that changed things, but just as a justice on the court, is there a typical day? What does that look like?
Well, if I have a day where there are no meetings, which really doesn't happen, the only thing that I would be doing is reading, and pretty much reading, because everything comes in on the record. We have attorneys that write the briefs. I have staff attorneys do the primary writing them off. So I'm either reading what they're writing about the briefs and arguments, or I'm reading and preparing for the cases that we're about to hear or about to decide. So by and large, if I'm working, I'm reading.
It almost sounds kind of isolating or lonely.
It can be. It can be. And that's the beauty of the job, is that we are elected, and you could debate whether that's wise or not. But because we're elected, We have the incentive to get out and about. And because we're elected and get out, people will invite us to events and to interact with the Kiwanis Club or Rotary Club or the law schools. And so it breaks up the day and it makes things interesting. Besides that, though, we do have a lot of administrative work. So within the judiciary, we have various committees and commissions and boards, and the Supreme Court is responsible ultimately for all of it. You serve on our Commission on Professionalism. You've seen the amount of work we've put into that. You yourself have put in a lot of work in that, for which we're grateful. And then we have all the various classes of court that work together to form the Judicial Council that I chair. But within the judiciary, we have the municipal court, magistrate court, probate court, juvenile court, state court, superior court, court of appeals, and our court. And I may have left out one, but we all form a judicial council. We meet 4 times a year, and we come up with a budget for all the pieces within the judiciary. We support legislation that impacts the judiciary. We have budget hearings. I have a budget hearing today from the House Committee at 2 o'clock. So there's a lot of different things. There's a Judicial Qualifications Commission that regulates judges. There's a Technology Committee. There's a Commission on Interpreters. There's an Access and Fairness Committee. So on and on. There's a lot of moving pieces that we're all engaged in.
Man, you don't think of any of that when you think of the job of judge.
That's right.
Well, tell us about becoming chief. How is that? How did that come about? And then how has that changed your working life?
The chief has a 4-year term on our court, and the chief is selected by the other justices. The secret is that it generally will track seniority, but I consider it an honor to have been selected by my peers to be chief. I took over as chief in September 20th, or something along those lines. And so it's been fun. In some ways it's been a lot to get on top of, and in some ways I've been prepared for it. I'll tell you how I've been prepared for it. The last several chiefs have operated in a way where all the responsibilities that we just talked about, we engage the other justices. And so you dispatch them to liaison with various committees and commissions. And Chief Justice Thompson, Chief Justice Hines both said, well, Harold, you're going to be chief soon. We're going to give you these responsibilities. And so they both were very intentional in making sure I was involved in the things that would best prepare me for when I took over. So in some respects, I'm probably as more prepared as anybody has been in a long time in terms of just being placed in the right place. And so that's been good. And following that model, I've been able to dispatch a lot of those responsibilities outward. So in some ways, I'm serving on fewer committees than I was before I became chief. That said, I'm the guy that everybody sends all those "is it okay if" memos, and so if there's somebody to blame, that's going to be me. I approve, all kinds of things and disapprove very few things, but because everything is generally well thought out. But I'm the guy that if something goes wrong, you blame. And then just being the spokesman for the judiciary, again going to the budget hearings. We have a State of the Judiciary speech that will be on the 19th of this month, which is a week and a half or so from now. I was up till 11 last night looking over that. That probably is the scariest thing I'll have to do, is the State of Judiciary. So y'all wish me well on that.
Set that scene for the students, because I don't think they probably know what you're talking about.
Right. So just as the President has a State of the Union address and the Governor has the State of the State, the Chief delivers a State of the Judiciary address to a joint session of the House and Senate in-house chambers. And so, you walk down the aisle just like the President of the United States and give a very stately address about the state of affairs within the judiciary.
one of the things that the students are learning about is the importance of mentors. You talked about Dan, and you talked about Mike Bowers. So, Chief Justice Hines was important in your life. Could you talk a little bit about him?
Yes. So Chief Justice Hines, I knew him as Judge Hines. The way I first met Judge Hines was explain why.
Chief Justice Hines died recently, and tragically, and it's still fresh. It's still raw. Take your time.
So I was at Auburn, and Hines loved Cobb County. And I grew up in Cobb County and went to high school out there. And there's an article about me in the local paper for my student government work. And his wife said, you gotta meet this guy. And so he reached out to me while I was still a student in college. And he said, well, next time you're in town, let's go to lunch. We went to lunch. And he gave me an opportunity to work for him after my first year in law school. And I went and worked for him, and it didn't feel like work. What it felt like was trying to stay awake while I was watching court happen. But all the lawyers came up to me and said, you're going to learn a lot. And I did. And I didn't realize how much I learned until I started practicing. And I saw my classmates struggle with things that seemed very common sense to me. And I realized that the reason why I was not unaware was because I'd seen what it looked like in real practice. So he and I became friends. We hit it off, and we would go to lunch, even when he stayed he remained as a Superior Court judge. And I was working in the AG's office, still went to lunch. So we've been going to lunch for 30 years. He came and joined the Supreme Court about 20 years ago. And so we were in the same building, or at least not right next to each other. And so we were able to go to lunch a lot more. And then we became colleagues on the same court. And he swore me in as chief this past September. So he is a dear friend, and be missed.
I've got just a couple more things to ask you before I turn this over to the students and their questions. I'm sure they have a lot of questions. But one thing I wanted to be sure to ask you was whether over the arc of your career, have there been any times when you think you've been treated differently because you're African American?
Well, I suppose so. I think my African American friends will attest that it's hard to know, because the way I've been treated all my life, so it's more the norm for me. But there's the situations I kind of know when I walk into a room where everybody kind of reads each other. We all read each other real quick, and there are many times I've walked into a room and realized, okay, this read's taking a little bit longer, and it was just fine. I play the long game. I'm used to that, and I know my strengths, I know my weaknesses, and I'm pretty confident that if they give me enough time, they'll learn my strengths and weaknesses. So I don't need to win the room in the first 5 minutes. I don't need to win it in the next week. I can win it 6 months, over a year. And if they're still not sure, and they're not sure whether they can give me the benefit of the doubt, then my job is to make sure I don't give them any reason to say anything bad about me. They could dislike me. I just need to make sure it's not for a good reason. So that's been my approach, and that's worked pretty well. Law school was a strange place, and one of the things I noticed, one of the first things that happened in my section in law school was folks were forming these study groups just instantly, without regard to who they knew. I think it was based on who looked smart. And I did not get invited to participate in any study groups, and so I clearly didn't look smart. Apparently I didn't look athletic either, because I didn't get invited to play on the softball team. But again, over time, we all got to know each other, and You know, the friendships that we formed were real. And so again, I just played a long game.
The last thing I want to do before I let the students ask their questions is to just give you an invitation here. If there's any advice that you want to give this group, as you know, this is the entire first year class and this year's cohort of transfer students. And so if there's any advice that you think they need to hear, maybe something you wish you'd have heard when you were in law school, whatever it is, this is an opportunity to do that. I'd invite you to do that.
So a few things. One is keep your head about you. In law school, it's real competitive. I know some places are more competitive. I know this is a very nurturing environment, so I think it has a more balanced approach, but it's still law school. And there's a sense that everybody's doing more to get ahead of you, and they're ahead and you're behind. And that sense is constantly, you know, at the back of your mind while you're here, if you're like me at least. And if you see somebody doing con law, you think, oh my gosh, they've already done everything else and now they're doing con law and I got to catch up. There's so many ways your mind plays tricks on you. I'm studying and they're interviewing. I'm interviewing, they're working their outlines. I'm working on my outlines, they're on law review. Oh my gosh, I'm behind. Keep your head about you. You'll be okay. A lot of what it takes to do well as in the practice of law is your knowledge of the law. Just as important, to do well, you got to be a good person. And it's not law school's job necessarily to focus on that aspect of it, but don't forget that part. Your primary tool as a lawyer is who you are as a person. And if I don't like dealing with you, I don't really care how much law you know, unless you're really, really good. And you see people like that. They're really, really good, but they're horses' rears. But if they ever miss out on their game, if they ever slip in their game, they're out. If you treat people right and people like you, and you make them better people, if you make the lawyers around you better, they'll want you wherever they go. They'll want you with them. So the other thing is, my oldest son is graduating from high school this year. And I've been asked to speak at his graduation, so I'm thinking, what it would be that I want to tell my son as he graduates. So I'm just now beginning to process this out, so I'll try it out on y'all first. I think the two things that come to mind are not go and take on the world and you can do all these great things, but how you go about going and taking on the world, and how, I would say, with grace and humility. Grace and humility. Just be humble. Just be humble. You know, you've got your law degree, but, you know, we're all in this world together, and we're all trying to get through. Whether you're at the S&S cafeteria and folks behind the counter, you know, everybody's trying to get through. So a little bit of humility as we interact with one another. We're not any better, we're not any worse. We just have some tools that we can bring to the table, along with the tools that everybody else can bring to the table. So humility as we go about our daily walk. And then grace. Folks do stupid stuff. I do stupid stuff. Nobody likes a hypocrite. But if we strive for high goals, high moral goals, and we fail, then we're hypocrites. If that's what we preach is right and we don't do it ourselves. But what makes that okay is if we extend grace to those who fail, knowing that when we fail, we're going to need grace too. The person that cuts us off in the middle of the highway, they need a little grace. Who knows what's in their mind? Who knows? But little grace and little humility, I think, will go a long way.
Great advice. What questions do you all have for Chief Justice Melton this morning? Yes, sir, Mr. Rusick.
Sorry for no great philosophical question, but as a downtown Atlanta resident, I've watched the new courts building come up. What are you most excited about, and what should future lawyers there be most excited about the new building?
What was the second part?
what should the people, you know,
Oh,
we
okay.
spent a
What
bunch
should
of
people?
$1 billion.
Why? Why should you care? Well, one thing I like about the new building is the air. I believe our building is probably a sick building. It's old. The HVAC system is old. All that needs to be gutted, and it will be gutted. All the other buildings on the hill have been substantially renovated. Asbestos, you name it. When I first, and I think some offices within our old building are worse than others. When I moved into the chief's office, I had a cough for the first month or so. It took me a while to get over it. Chief Justice Hines had a cough the whole time. Justice Hines, I said, did you notice a difference when you, she said, yeah, I absolutely did. So, I'm looking forward to breathing. There are a number of other aspects. Security is a big deal in the old building. When we have court at 10 o'clock, and 9 o'clock folks start showing up to the courtroom. When you show up, if I show up at 9 o'clock and I get on the elevator, I'm riding up the elevator with the litigants and their attorneys. And that's just a bad look. The new building's beautiful. If you haven't seen it, it's right in the old space of the old archives building. It's right on 20 and Capitol. It's a $110, $115 million building. So here's what should matter to you guys. To me, the way it's framed, it looks directly at the Capitol. We were careful to make sure that it wasn't taller than the Capitol, but it's respectfully in relationship to the Capitol, and it squarely stares at it. So it defers to the legislature and the governor in terms of the presumption of constitutionality that they're entitled to have, but we're staring at them squarely to say that we're ready to do our work if we have to. Here's the other thing that's kind of important, I think. You know, in our building's about 50 or 60 years old. And we talk about the rule of law and the importance of rule of law, but we've got some things that we can't really explain that have come out of our court over the last 50 or 60 years. And we have a new start here. And I'm hoping that as we go into that new building that it's kind of a refresh button to say that let's make sure that everything we do in this new building has in mind of really doing it right. Let's make sure no opinions come out of here that we have to apologize for. That's not to say we get it right every time. We try to get it right. I'm sure something will be overruled or reversed, overruled down the line. But I don't want somebody to look at our opinions and say, "What were they thinking?" Or that's just backwards. That's embarrassing. It's a beautiful building, and what it tells me every day when we walk into that is that the citizens of this state have invested a lot of time and resources to make sure that we take it seriously, the job that's assigned to us when we go in there. I had that feeling when I walked into the Capitol working for the governor, that I was going in there not just to see the two-headed squirrel, but to actually do the work of the people in this beautiful building. And I expect that we'll have that same sense when we walk in that building every day. The questions you have? Yes, sir.
Good morning, Chief Justice. So how do you remain connected to the people from your role currently as the Chief Justice?
You ever been married? The question was, how do I remain connected? You know, my wife's primary job is to keep my feet on the ground. My kids keep my feet on the ground. My neighbors, we have a great neighborhood, and just my church, my own sense of knowledge of my weaknesses. One of the things that's kind of funny is that marriage has a way of teaching you about yourself, and I do believe that my wife is God's gift to me, and I can complain about my wife does this and my wife does that. And every time I do, God has a way of saying, yeah, that's pretty much how you treat me. And whenever I think that, I think, okay, let me slow down here. And so that has a lot to do, just continually looking inward to seeing all the work that's left for me to do. I think hopefully keeps me grounded.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, Justice. I was wondering, you interact with a lot of lawyers inside and outside the courtroom. What type of faux pas have you seen like beginning lawyers do? What would you have advise?
Faux pas of beginning lawyers. So, a couple of things. One, lawyers really, this sounds obvious, lawyers really should know their case. They really should prepare. You would think, okay, when I'm going to the state Supreme Court, I'm going to prepare. So our court, maybe watch some videos. Our court's a little bit different than the way it was 10, 15 years ago. If you're going to argue in front of our court, I would encourage you to watch some videos that are online and see the kind of questions that you can anticipate. You're going to see questions about the cases that you are pointing to support your argument. So that's very obvious, right? But that's not going to be good enough. You need to know if those cases make sense. And did those cases rely on cases that made sense? If a case that you rely on just said it, chances are you're going to be asked, well, why should we rely on that case? And you're going to need to have answers. Some faux pas. If we ask you, for example, what is the outcome that you're asking for us to provide in this case, you need to have an answer. Some attorneys don't have an answer. And I've gone so far as to ask, tell me what you want the holding to be. And you need to write the holding out for us. Go ahead and tell us. Because if you can't write it, then there's a good chance there's a reason why. So go ahead and be able to articulate what the answer is. Then the follow-up question is, how do you propose we get there? And the answer need not be, well, you're the Supreme Court, you can do whatever you want. That won't work. We get that answer about once a quarter. And that's not very fulfilling. Those are the main things.
Yes, sir. Good morning, Chief Justice. Is there any one case in the time since you've been on the Supreme Court that really stands out as landmark, or probably your favorite case that has had a decision?
Favorite case? Oh, gosh. I was real proud of a good workers' comp decision we had. I say that tongue-in-cheek. There was one case that really stood out that mainly just because of the national attention, and that was the Gennaro Wilson case. And y'all probably too young to remember, but it was about maybe 10 years ago now. How old are y'all? Yeah. So you could Google it. Gennaro Wilson was a high school student who was involved at a party. I think it was a New Year's party or something along those lines with some older dudes. And in the process, there's a young lady who was intoxicated or somehow chemically compromised, and there's a videotape of these young men, taking advantage of her. And so he was prosecuted for rape. The gentlemen, all who were older, all pled, and they got like 5 years. And so when he was prosecuted, he was acquitted of rape, but convicted of some type of aggravated sexual assault. At the time, the mandatory minimum was 10 years. So he got 10 years. He was a high school student, B+ student, athlete. The national narrative was, here's a young man who was acquitted of rape, so they took that to mean that it was then consensual. And the basis for the conviction was the age disparity, because he was 18 and she was 15. I can't remember the age, but because the age disparity was such that it made it a violation of this, whatever the sexual assault provision was, he got mandatory 10. And took hold nationally because he was African American, is African American, and it became a race issue. He's being prosecuted because he's black, and he's getting 10 years because he's black. It resonated with me because I'm just shaking my head because he was African American, the victims were African American. The victim, young lady, was African American. And the jury acquitted him of the most serious charge, which was rape, which told me that they gave him very strong consideration, notwithstanding race. The only reason why he got the 10 years was because of the operation of the statute. And the statute was not put in place on the basis of race. In fact, 2 years prior, we affirmed a conviction of a white young man under the exact same statute, at least in my mind was the exact same statute. But none of that changed the conversation. The other thing that struck me was the legislature had just ended its session, and then the appeal came to our court after the legislative session. Now, you guys have studied civics. If there's a problem with the law and you want to change the law, who's the body you go to change the law? You go to the legislature. Well, the advocates sat out the legislative session. They didn't do anything. But when the court hearing came, because that's when the case was front and center, everybody got engaged and became activated to try to seek change in the judicial process, which is not, in my mind, how it's supposed to be done. So I'm thinking, the civics lessons have meaning in real life. Folks, seek change in the legislative process. End result of that was we did overturn his conviction. It was a 4-3 decision. At the time, there were 7 of us on the court. I was in the minority. And we determined that his conviction violated the 8th Amendment cruel and unusual punishment provision. Fast forward, there was a state senator who was engaged in the legislative process and went the extra step and got engaged with Mr. Gennaro personally. And I was asked to speak at a church for the Men's Day, Sunday. And Senator Jones was a member of that church, and he brought Gennaro Wilson there. And so I spoke, and afterwards I said, hey, let's go talk. So we went into a room, and I said to him, you know who I am? He says, yes. And he said, you know how I voted? He said, yes. He said, I expected you to. He'd done his research. He researched all the cases. He knew the votes going in. Very smart young man. And we had a nice conversation. I said, how you doing? He said, I'm doing good. He says, I'm come home. I keep my head down, stay out of trouble. I don't go anywhere. I don't do anything. I'm good. Graduated high school. I think he went to college. Pretty sure he went to college. And I told him, well, that's good. But there's a time when going home and staying out of trouble has to, you have to put that aside. Because you're not on this earth to go home and stay out of trouble. You're on this earth to go out and conquer. And so you've been given a break, not so you can go home and stay out of trouble. You've been given a break so you can go out and do something. And I'm hoping he heard that. He's a nice young man, and I have every belief that he will do well.
Chief, I'm sorry we're out of time, but join me in thanking Chief.